had a long way to go. Between 1910 and 1914, Britain was convulsed by a series of violent incidents. Buildings were set on fire, telephone lines were cut, windows were smashed, the Prime Minister was attacked. These were not the acts of hooligans or of rebels trying to overthrow the state. They were protests by women seeking the vote. During the 19th century, women had made great progress towards equality, but they lacked one very important right to vote at general elections. In fact, not all men could vote, though after various vigorous campaigns by 1884, about 3/4 of the adult men in Britain had won the vote. But no women. Yet as early as 1867, a movement for women's suffrage had been launched. Committees were founded in Manchester and London and attracted thousands of support. Young girls braved male disapproval by speaking out in public. In 1897, Militant Fawcett linked these committees in the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. But although she had much sympathy in Parliament, opposition to women was too strong.
I object to bringing them down into the sordid arena of politics. I shall oppose all attempts to break down the barrier which nature has placed between men and women. I believe I am supported by the vast majority of women in this country.
Militant Fawcett believed in persuasion. She always told her supporters they must not break the law. But soon, a more dynamic campaign began, led by Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a brilliant speaker who could inspire her followers to total dedication. She was convinced that women must have a direct voice in Parliament, and she said that the time had come for women to stop asking for the vote and start fighting for it. In 1903, she founded a new militant organisation of her own, the Women's Social and Political Union. Its slogan was simple: votes for women. Mrs. Pankhurst's leading supporter was her eldest daughter, Christabel, a brilliant young law student. And it was Christabel who caused a major sensation in 1905, when she and another campaigner interrupted a big political meeting in Manchester.
Jail for lady hecklers. Sir Edward Grey's disturbers refused to pay fines.
Well, Christabel was sent to prison, but soon released, and the incident gained publicity and support for the Pankhurst's campaign. They built up funds, and their confidence grew. They founded a suffragette newspaper called Votes for Women, which gave the movement a public voice. The Pankhursts now felt strong enough to carry the campaign to Parliament. A Labour MP had introduced a bill to give the vote to women, but it was blocked. A group of suffragettes had been listening with mounting disgust from the ladies' gallery. They sprang to their feet and created an uproar.
Suffragettes in Parliament. Scene in the House of Commons. Ladies' gallery cleared. Interruptions and flag waving. Unparalleled incident.
Setback to women's suffrage. The grim but grotesque band of women suffragists who invaded the House of Commons and made a disturbance necessitating their expulsion can at least claim to have accomplished something. In a single evening, they have set back their own cause for a decade.
In spite of disapproval, the direct action campaign was well and truly launched, and it began to make real progress. More and more women were recruited. Meetings were held all over the country. Pamphlets and handbills were distributed in the streets. And as Grace Rowe remembers, the newspaper Votes for Women was widely sold.
It was very amusing sometimes, the things that would happen when you were out selling votes for women. I remember once standing at the St. George's Hospital, and I was selling the paper, and a man dressed in frock coat, top hat, and came, and he was furious. He took the paper out of my hand, he threw it on the ground, and he stamped on it like a child in a rage. I remember another time standing outside the Queen's Hall, also selling the paper, and a very aristocratic woman came and spat in my face. It was something to do with the effect. We had a tremendous effect upon people.
From 1906 on, Mrs. Pankhurst sent a whole series of deputations to the House of Commons. But although they hoped for sympathy from the Liberal government, they were disappointed. Mr. Asquith, Chancellor of the Exchequer until 1908 and Prime Minister until 1916, was not convinced that politics would gain by giving women the vote. Right to the end of his career, he had a certain contempt for them.
They are, for the most part, hopelessly ignorant of politics, credulous to the last degree, and flickering with gusts of sentiment, like a candle in the wind.
In the years that followed, bill after bill demanding votes for women foundered on Mr. Asquith's weighty opposition. The women now felt that their only hope lay in more militancy. They had to force the Liberal government to give way. Some suffragettes, shouting "Votes for Women," chained themselves to the railings in Parliament Square. A few fanatics even attacked unpopular ministers with whips. And many hundreds of women took part in demonstrations outside Parliament.
Suffragists march on Parliament. Mounted police ready. Raiders repelled.
And these were not the only forms of protest. One group specialised in refusing to pay their taxes. The redoubtable Flora Drummond was found camping on MPs' front doorsteps and heckling them from a boat on the Thames. But although this gained publicity for the movement, the average man still remained cynical.
All the boys are longing to be put amongst the girls. Bless their little coals, they're all right are the girls. That's when they keep themselves as girls, but very sad to state, there's some of them has got into a fighting mood of late. So when the woman of today comes near, let me be miles away. Puts me upon an island where the girls are few. Puts me amongst the most ferocious lions in the zoo. You can put me upon a treadmill and I'll never, never fret. But for pity's sake, don't put me near a suffragette. But for pity's sake, don't put me near a suffragette.
Like suffragettes, others took them very seriously. In 1908, Mrs. Pankhurst handed out bills asking men and women, help the suffragettes to rush the House of Commons. Christabel, Mrs. Pankhurst, and Flora Drummond were arrested and tried at Bow Street for incitement to violence. Christabel made powerful use of her legal training to conduct the defence, and her mother, giving evidence, spoke passionately on behalf of the movement.
We know how bad the position is of women workers. Some of us have worked for many years to help our own sex, and we have been driven to the conclusion that only through legislation can any improvement be effected, and that legislation can never be obtained until we have the same electoral power as men.
In spite of this, they were convicted and sent to jail. But the demonstrations continued, and more of their supporters were arrested and imprisoned. Many of the prisoners began to go on hunger strike, refusing to eat, but the authorities responded by subjecting them to forcible feeding, a method often used for lunatics. These means were widely disapproved of, and it's easy to see why. Lillian Lenton recalls what it was like.
I don't like talking about these things. Anyway, you want to know what it was, actually? I've never told people. Well, the game was to, well, they push a tube up the nostril, which goes wriggling down into the stomach. Then there's a funnel on the end of the tube. They pour the food in, you see. But I was determined to stop them if I could. And all the time they were trying to push this very tube down, I kept up coughing and coughing and coughing without stopping, kept it up incessantly. Well, they kept on trying, and after a bit, I suppose they thought they'd succeeded. They poured food in. I didn't see, because I always kept my eyes shut on these unpleasant occasions. And they went away thinking they'd finished, I suppose. But in almost no time, intense pains, not little bits of ones, but intense pains came all round my chest. And I could not breathe. It was almost impossible to breathe. Well, I didn't know what was the matter, but I understood it was double pneumonia and pleurisy, due to food getting into the lung, which might easily have happened because of the way I kept up this perpetual coughing, causing things to go the wrong way and all the rest of it. But when I got out, I sent a postcard to my parents, on which I wrote, "Out. Double pneumonia and pleurisy, but quite all right."
By 1910, the women thought they were on the verge of success. A bill had been prepared to give the vote to women householders, and the women's movements combined to hold a triumphal procession. But it all came to nothing because of lack of support in Parliament. The result was more violence. On November the 18th, 1910, a peaceful deputation to the House of Commons was hemmed in by the police. When the women tried to join their leaders, gangs of toughs attacked them and threw them to the ground. But it was the suffragettes who got the blame.
Suffragist rioters. Fierce battle with the police at Westminster. 119 arrests.
In spite of the press reaction, the support for the women at this time was considerable. And if Asquith had given his approval to the bill, it would probably have got through. But he didn't, and he continued to hold up progress throughout 1911. So in 1912, the suffragettes turned to even wilder acts of violence. Parties of women went on window-smashing raids in the centre of London. As a result, the suffragette headquarters were raided by the police, and most of the ringleaders were arrested. Christabel escaped to France to direct the movement in exile. 2 years of really dangerous violence followed. Telephone wires were cut, letterboxes were set on fire, and property was attacked. A bomb was exploded in Lloyd George's house. Houses and public buildings were burnt down, and so was a church. Hundreds of women were sent to prison for their part in these acts. Many, like Sylvia, Mrs. Pankhurst's younger daughter, were made seriously ill by hunger strikes and forcible feeding, so the authorities were forced to release them before their sentences were completed. But now the government passed a law known as the Cat and Mouse Act. Prisoners on hunger strike were released on license, only to be rearrested when they had recovered. Although many people were horrified by the government's policy, it was the suffragettes' own violence which continued to hold the headlines.
Anarchy and havoc. Scottish mansion destroyed by malignants.
Bomb in the Abbey. Fury's maddest act.
The last straw. Suffragette crime goes beyond all bounds.
Millicent Fawcett, whose peaceful campaigning had gained her many thousands of followers, was also critical.
I think they would rather lose women's suffrage than give up their own way of demonstrating.
In June 1913, she organised a 6-week pilgrimage to London to try and win back public support. Women from all over England converged on the capital, holding meetings along the way and ending with a mass rally in Hyde Park. But meanwhile, the militants had seized the headlines again. On June the 4th, 1913, the Derby was held. Among the crowds watching at Tattenham Corner was Emily Wilding Davis, a militant suffragette who had begun the arson campaign. As the King's horse flashed by, she threw herself under its hoofs. The race went on, but Emily Davison was dying. The suffragettes had their first martyr, and thousands came to her funeral. Mrs. Pankhurst was not deterred by Emily Davison's death. She saw it as a valiant sacrifice in the suffrage struggle, and she continued the militant campaign as relentlessly as ever. In March 1914, she led a deputation to Buckingham Palace to try and present a petition to the King. But they were quickly headed off by the police. Mrs. Pankhurst and her followers were forcibly carried away. Yet the determination of the suffragettes was impressive, and so was the solid and growing support won by the patient campaigns of Mrs. Fawcett. It's probable they would at last have won a victory if a greater struggle had not intervened. Britain was at war, and most women proved as patriotic as the men. Millicent Fawcett spoke for them.
Let us show ourselves worthy of citizenship, whether our claim to it be recognized or not.